friends, my name is Jenny and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be chatting through the 22 books that I read in the first quarter of 2022. Most of these are probably going to be pretty short and snappy because honestly I don't remember a ton about these books. This quarter was a bit of a blur. I was reading a lot of things but not really engaging super intentionally with any of them, in part just because the rest of my life was just kind of crazy and books were not like providing me the kind of solace that they often are, which was also unfortunate, but I still wanted to kind of chat about them. Also, sorry for the glare in my glasses. I have my door open because it's a beautiful spring day outside. So let's just, without further ado, get into the 22 books that I read. Some of which, as particularly the ones at the beginning, I've talked about in other videos, so I will put a link to those when necessary. So the first one that I read was Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World by Katherine Hayhoe. This I gave 5 stars to. I have an individual review of this on my channel. Definitely a great start to my reading year. I think a really important and powerful book. Definitely kind of taught me a lot in terms of thinking about the climate crisis as something that needs a lot of compassion and understanding and not necessarily a lot of rage, I think is the best way to put that book, but really would highly recommend it if like the climate crisis is something that you are interested in engaging with. I thought this was a really well done book about it, and I think also kind of informs the reader about the climate crisis in a way that's pretty easy to understand. And then next book was Olga Dies Dreaming by Xochitl Gonzalez. I talked about this one as well as the next like 3 or 4, I think, in a reading vlog that I also will put a link to in the cards above. This was a book of the month book that was a debut novel that I really enjoyed. I think it was a 2022 release, if I remember correctly. And it's about 2 siblings living in New York City who are both of Puerto Rican descent, or I guess they're first generation New Yorkers, but their parents are from Puerto Rico. They've lived with their grandparents. Their parents were both kind of revolutionaries, activists who left them, and so there's a lot of discussion there about parental figures who have left you and the impact that that has on you and whether or not those people deserve your forgiveness and how you should feel about those people and the kind of complicated feelings that surround a parent leaving you when you are a child. There's also some kind of political stuff there. It got a little dramatic from what I remember, but still like an engaging read if you are a fan of kind of family stories, and particularly family stories that involve kind of broader issues, as a lot of topics related to like the Latinx experience and particularly the Puerto Rican experience, which I learned a lot because I know very little about Puerto Rico and its kind of broader relationship with the United States, and I think this book was a good kind of foundation for that. Definitely something I'm interested in learning more about. Next up was Many Were Stories by Morgan Thomas. This was another 2022 release. I believe I read this as an ARC, and this was a short story collection. Again, I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, as I did with Olga Dies Dreaming, and the stories primarily focus on queer identity, trans identity, but also a lot of themes of like motherhood and pregnancy and kind of bodily changes more broadly, which I thought was cool. I really like themes of pregnancy and motherhood in books, and I thought the stories that tackled that, particularly as it intersects with trans identities, was really interesting. I definitely would read more of Morgan Thomas's work. I believe this was their debut thing that's been published, so definitely will continue to keep an eye on them. Then another nonfiction book I read was Why We Swim by Bonnie Choi. This one I also really enjoyed, gave 4 stars, about both the like kind of physiological elements and psychological elements of why we swim, but then the last section also touches on some of the kind of cultural significance of swimming across the world and why we feel so drawn to it. And I really liked it. I love to swim as a kind of form of exercise, but also I've just like always enjoyed being in the water and like going to the beach and just playing in pools and stuff is really fun. And so it's interesting to kind of hear a more kind of scientific basis for why that might be the case. Editing Jenny popping in here to talk about one of the books that I forgot to mention, which is Luck in the Shadows by Lynn Flewelling. I talked about this one also in the reading vlog with Manywhere and Why We Swim. I gave this one 4.5 stars. I think it was written in the 90s, and it's a classic fantasy rom about these 2 characters, one of whom helps the other escape prison right at the beginning of the novel, and they kind of decide to like form a friendship and continue to kind of go on adventures together, and it just was really fun. I think it was really well paced. The characters were really
a bit more nuanced for like how tropey it was, and I also just really enjoyed the kind of political intrigue and like mystery throughout it. I read it over the course of like 2 days or something, which I talk about in that reading blog, so do check that out up above. But I just wanted to quickly mention that because I had forgotten it, and I didn't want to because I'm really excited about continuing on in this series. Really glad that I finally got to this one. It had been sitting on my shelves for like years and years. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming.
The next one that I don't think I've talked about previously on my channel that I read was Fiona and Jane by Jean Chen Ho. This one I gave 3 stars to, and I thought it was just okay. So it was a novel in stories about these 2 best friends, Fiona and Jane. And we follow them in the stories at different points in their lives, but never really their friendship. Like, their friendship is not the center of the story. It's primarily about the 2 of them, but we switch perspectives between whose story we're following. And obviously their friendship, because they were like childhood best friends, continues to inform your life, even if you're not like speaking to one another or you're not super close at that moment in time. But yeah, I don't know, I just didn't particularly feel connected to any of the stories. I think they felt a little overwrought, would I say. I wish it'd been either more of a collection with other perspectives or just like kind of stories that were not directly tied to them, because I think some of the stories continue to like deal with the same topics, or it had been a bit more of a kind of novel of like the through line. It didn't even necessarily have to be linear, but it had to be more kind of these integral moments in their lives that like inform perhaps like the primary story or like the last story, and you can kind of see the threads a bit better. Whereas it felt like it was kind of a disconnected collection of moments into young people's lives, which was interesting, just like not exactly as fluid and connected as I really wanted it to be. The next book I read, which was definitely my favorite book of the quarter and one that I am hoping to reread over the summer, just to kind of reorient myself with it and I think more deeply about it. So that was Heaven is a Place on Earth by Adrian Shirk. So this is a really interesting blend of a lot of different kind of subgenres. So it's in part a very niche history of like utopian building movements in the United States and why throughout the history of the United States as, you know, kind of white dominated like settler colonial place has utopia and like moving away from society and doing your own thing been such a strong pull for so many Americans throughout our brief history. And what kind of does that say about like the American ideals of, you know, individualism and free thinking and stuff. Also an interesting exploration of the idea of utopia itself and like what does that mean, and thinking about it in the form of like caregiving and thinking about utopias as places of happiness. And she throughout the book has these really interesting little notes of places where she calls them utopian notes, and they're basically just moments in her life that I interpreted to be moments that she felt she was living in a utopia, however brief that was. And like one of them, for one example, was her and some friends on a road trip like getting ice cream on an afternoon, and just that feeling of in that moment in time you are living the like most perfect life, but that's not also how life always is. And that's also what makes those moments special, is that they are temporary and therefore that much more valuable. So that is then kind of also informing the like third element of the book, which is basically an exploration of like the dissolution of her marriage due to a lot of different factors, COVID kind of being the breaking point for them. And so I think there's a lot of reflection here too about that relationship, and it's not entirely like centered on the page, but you can feel it, especially as you get kind of towards the end of the book, that this is becoming more and a kind of internal reflection. And through this project of like her researching utopians, her, you know, life with this person was like falling apart, and the impact that that had on her research and stuff. And it was so beautiful. I loved it so much. Really just like kind of, I don't know if it like hit me at the right moment or it was just like really the type of nonfiction I love to read, but I absolutely loved it. I don't think I'd really recommend it to like anyone because I have very specific niche tastes and it like met all of those tastes. But if you have those similar like tastes in nonfiction in terms of like weird deep dives into like American ideology and how that informs our history, and like talking about relationships and weird little moments when you're on a road trip, like I would highly recommend this book for that reason, but I'm not sure what audience that is. So I loved it. I definitely will reread it, and I think perhaps do some sort of like reading vlog or at least like a review of it after I read it the second time, just because I did really thoroughly enjoy it. So that was Heaven is a Place on Earth. Then I started my semester. That was the last book I read before I started school, and I read A Kind of Freedom by Margaret Wilkerson Sexton. So I read The Revisioners by Margaret Wilkerson Sexton probably like 2 years ago now, and really enjoyed it. So I was curious to read her debut novel, which is A Kind of Freedom. But honestly, I think the two are very similar, and I think The Revisioners did it a bit better. So both novels are like dual timeline novels that talk about family relationships and the struggles of being a Black person in America, to put it simply. So A Kind of Freedom follows 3 timelines: a grandmother, a mother, and a son. And the grandmother's timeline is the 1940s, right around World War II. Mother's timeline is the 1980s. And then the son's timeline is like just post-Katrina. All of this is set in like the New Orleans area. And all 3 of them, the story is kind of grappling with the ideas of like, what did it mean to be a Black individual living in the South at this time, and like what were the ways that racism and systemic inequality were informing their ability to do things. So all 3 of them are grappling with kind of really pertinent issues to the Black experience during that time period. So I thought that was interesting, but I don't know, there was something about it that I didn't really click with me. I didn't really care for any of the characters. All 3 of them also kind of grapple with themes of parenthood and pregnancy and untimed pregnancies or poorly timed pregnancies, and the kind of impact that having a child has on your trajectory. So there's also an interesting kind of through thread of like each of the additional people was kind of a character, and it was informing the decisions of the older character's life. The Revisioners also does this dual timeline thing, and I think it does it a bit more effectively. So if you are interested in reading her work, and I did really like The Revisioners, I'd probably go with that one than A Kind of Freedom. But if you are interested in Kind of Freedom, I mean, it was good. I gave it 3.5 stars. Then the next book I read was Beautiful Revolutionary by Laura Elizabeth Willett. This book was really weird. It was another historical fiction book set during the rise of the Jim Jonestown cult, beginning first in California and then eventually moving to Guyana. And this book is split into 3 sections, and each section kind of follows a different set of characters, I guess. I don't know. I felt like this book, to me, she had a great idea of like a young couple who kind of gets pulled into Jim Jones's orbit and falls into that kind of chaos. And that like first part, which was exploring that idea, was really good. I was super into it. I was like, this is so weird, but I love it. And it's all about, I don't know, just like naivety and, you know, people who have really kind of charismatic personalities. But then it just like fell off the rails for me, and I think I was having a harder and harder time to buy into the very blatant abuse that was happening within the cult environment and people's inability to see that, or people's ability to see it but like not able to do anything. And I think I, as a very like analytical, logical person, was just really struggling with like overcoming that suspension of disbelief, which was made even more so because this was a real thing that happened. I don't know. And it also, there were some ways in which that I feel like it glorified Jim Jones and his kind of most loyal followers to a degree that I didn't think was necessary given the aftermath of like what happened. And it does go into that, but I don't know, it just felt a little too like on his side when it should have, to me, been made more powerful had it been on the side of all these people that were like under his power. It's difficult for me to explain, and again, this was like one that I read a long time ago, so I don't have a ton of clear thoughts on it, but I just like, I didn't think that Laura Elizabeth Willett did justice to the primary victims of that story in a way that was at all very satisfying. So it kind of left a sour taste in my mouth, so I only ended up giving it 3 stars. Then the next book I read was Oh Beautiful by Jung Yoon. I was really excited about this one because it was blurbed to me by Matthew Sharpa, who I really enjoy watching, would highly recommend checking him out. As a woman from North Dakota, returning to North Dakota to write about the oil boom there, and that was definitely what it was about. It wasn't about a whole lot else, which was one kind of gripe-ish that I had with the novel. I also just found it a little too like blatant in its thematic exploration. So I think the novel's really tackling like this idea of how oil towns breed misogyny and racism and just kind of this very toxic environment, but that just, I don't know, was really kind of beaten over the head of the reader in a way that I don't think was necessary. Like, I think that is a pretty like easy claim to make, and so I think it could have been a lot more subtle in the way that it was explored. There was a kind of through line mystery about a woman who had gone missing, and there wasn't really any kind of solid conclusion about that, which I didn't love. In the end, I gave this 4 stars. I would recommend it, I think, but I don't know, I wanted more from it because it sounded like a book that I would just like absolutely love, and it ended up being just okay. Then the next book I read was Hook, Line, and Sinker by Tessa Bailey. This I gave 3 stars too. It's like a friends to lovers romance. I didn't read the first one, which I think probably would have helped because I think it set up the relationship that was in here. But this one is following the younger sister of the first one and this guy who's a big like kind of ladies man in the town. He's basically like slept with everyone in this small seaside town in Washington state, and the two of them have this really kind of close bond, very flirtatious but definitely platonic, but they both obviously also have kind of romantic feelings for one another. And so this book is tackling that, and also really tackling the idea of the ladies man guy main character and his kind of struggles with this being his role within the community and this being everything that everyone knows about him, and so therefore he doesn't feel like people take him seriously or people believe that he could be responsible. And so there was a lot of kind of discussion about that and the kind of difficulties of the gendered roles of like being a kind of sexual stereotype, which I thought was interesting. I also when I was reading this book was like dating, and so it was like a weird kind of reading experience to like be reading a romance novel when I was like going on multiple dates with someone. Like that part of my brain, and that is true for a later book as well, like that those connections were difficult to kind of disentangle, which also I think hindered my reading experience because I was like, this just kind of feels weird to be like reading this book. But I kept on keeping on, which may have been a mistake. I may have done this book a disservice, but definitely not like my favorite Tessa Bailey that I've ever read. Then I read After the Storm, Black Intellectuals Explore the Meaning of Hurricane Katrina, which was edited by David Dante Trout. This one I read for my booktube spin list pick. I thought it was interesting. It's was really the most interesting aspect of it was reading it kind of with a historiographical lens, in that it was published in 2006, and basically everything that was talked about are still issues that we have not really grappled with, primarily kind of intersectional identities as it relates to Blackness, primarily Blackness and poverty, and the vilification of that and the dehumanization of people who are both Black and poor, and particularly living in urban environments but rural environments as well. From my perspective of like reading this book that was from 2006 talking about the kind of failures of Katrina, I'm not sure if an event like that were to happen again that any of those things would be much different, except obviously, you know, New Orleans built a lot of physical infrastructure, but I think the like kind of social lessons that were to be learned from Katrina, I am not sure we really have learned them, which was a really interesting kind of thought reflection experience. I also am very curious because I don't know a ton about New Orleans kind of rebuilding process, but I have to assume that like the Great Recession of 2008-9 impacted the rebuilding, and I do know like a little bit of that history, but I'm very curious to read the Katrina history book, which I think goes until 2015, because I'd love to kind of learn more about that post Katrina New Orleans rebuilding process and just how that kind of continued to fail the communities that existed in New Orleans prior to Hurricane Katrina, as I know that that is the reality of what ended up happening. So that was an interesting aspect of reading this book too, was that so much of the building had not yet begun when this book was published, but reading it knowing the kind of outcome was really interesting. So yeah, I don't think I again recommend this book because it's like very niche and also from 2006, and I think there's other books about Hurricane Katrina that are probably more valuable, but I'm glad I gave it a try. Then the next book I read was Canopy Poems by Linda Gregerson. Do not remember a single thing about this book. I'm so sorry. It was vaguely reminiscent of Mary Oliver, but none of the poems really connected with me all that much. I gave it 3 stars. Not really sure I'd recommend it as a collection, but I've also never read Linda Gregerson, so if you're a fan of her work, this is her new collection. I read 2 books that were both kind of like mini primers on environmentalism that I thought were both okay. I gave them both 3.5 stars. The first of which was The Intersectional Environmentalists: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet by Leah Thomas. So Leah Thomas is in this weird kind of new phenomenon that's happening of like Instagram influencers slash just social media influencers more broadly who are really interested in ideas of sustainability and environmentalism. And she is one of them who basically during the, I believe she kind of got her rise primarily during the Black Lives Matter resurgence in the summer of 2020, basically talking about how environmentalism is inherently intersectional and we should acknowledge people of color and those who are living in poverty as the kind of individuals who will be most impacted by climate change. So this book was basically a lot of her Instagram posts in book form, and therefore it kind of felt like a really long Instagram post. It also is a topic that I have engaged with on like academic levels, and so, you know, reading the definition of intersectionality was just not very helpful to me, but hopefully to other people it will be more helpful. And then the other one I read was Stop Saving the Planet, an Environmentalist Manifesto by Jenny Price. This one was more so focused on the ideas that corporations in America are controlling a lot of the narrative surrounding environmentalism, i.e. through like greenwashing of their business while kind of lobbying for lack of regulation in terms of releasing pollutants and using up fossil fuels. And also the kind of narrative that's been shaped about consumer guilt surrounding environmental choices. So I thought that was really interesting, definitely things that I've kind of been exposed to before, but she writes in a very like wry way that was funny. I enjoyed reading her perspective on things, and Stop Saving the Planet also has a list of kind of actionable items. The Intersectional Environmentalist does too, but I found the Stop Saving the Planet one to be more nuanced, I guess, or just like more worthy of engagement. That sounds bad, but that's how I felt. And so I'd recommend like checking out just to kind of see some of those things, as I think they're pretty actionable items that maybe you potentially wouldn't think about otherwise when like thinking about how to make your life more environmentally friendly and how to get more involved kind of in the fight against companies that are controlling and destroying our planet. The next book I read was Outlawed by Anna North. I gave this 3.5 stars. This is like a feminist Western novel about a young woman who is unable to have children. So she was like married to someone, unable to have children, and then basically got outcast from her community. No idea how like historically accurate this book was, but it was quite a romp regardless. And so she gets outcast, eventually goes to nunnery, but then gets kicked out of the nunnery because she wants, or doesn't get kicked out, she leaves the nunnery to go find this group of bandits who apparently are like super feminist and they're all like barren women, and she's gonna go like hang out with them, and it's just kind of a Western like adventurous romp from there of like this group of people getting involved in reclaiming their identity as like women. It was interesting. I don't know, I wish it had been a little more kind of thematically rich, I think, but it was like a fun, engaging story. I read it pretty quickly and definitely like outside of what I would normally read, but still fun. Then the next book I read was A Taste of Her Own Medicine by Tasha Harrison. This I gave 3 stars to, and was the other book that I was experiencing a negative dating situation at that moment in time, and so I've kind of blocked this book out in part because of that. Because it was another romance novel about an older woman who's recently divorced, has like 2 children who are in high school, but she decides to start a small business, and there's a guy who's like a community development, economic development guy who runs like small business workshops, who I guess is like super hot. He's like 15 years younger than her, and the 2 of them have like an insta-lust situation. He helps her with her business and they fall in love, and that's basically the premise. I wasn't really blown away by it. I was a little frustrated too by their like insta-lust, but also I absolutely know that like my own life circumstances were informing how I was feeling about this book, so I don't really feel qualified to like say anything else about it, but I gave it 3 stars. Maybe check it out or check out the reviews out if it sounds at all interesting to you. Then over spring break, I've read The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich, and actually this one, no, it wasn't over spring break, it was the week before spring break. I also vlogged about this one, so I will put a link to that vlog up in the cards above. And I enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. It's the second Erdrich book I think I've read, and this one is a historical fiction novel set in the 50s about two people, one of whom is trying to find her sister who has moved to Minneapolis and left the reservation, but she seems to have gone missing. And then the other one is about a man named Thomas who is working with some other members of the community to ensure that their tribe doesn't get disbanded, which was something that was in the works in Congress because of some kind of Mormon congressmen, which was really interesting history to learn about and something I kind of knew nothing about. I love Erdrich's writing style. I think she's really evocative of an atmosphere and a place, and I thought the story was interesting. I learned things. I had a good time. I'd recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. Then, over spring break, in preparation of Bridgerton Season 2, I read The Viscount Who Left Me by Julia Quinn. I gave this 4 stars as well, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. It's definitely very different from the second season of Bridgerton, which I also really loved. But yeah, I thought it was a fun story. I really liked seeing Anthony transform from someone who doesn't think he's capable or worthy of love to realizing that he is. I also think Kate is a badass lady, and I really liked her as a character both in the book and the show. I feel like everyone and their mom probably is familiar basically with the premise, but it's like an enemies to lovers historical romance about a guy who's a rake who's decided he wants to take a wife, and so he decides that he's going to marry Kate's younger sister, and Kate's like, absolutely not, because you're a rake and you don't love my sister. And the two of them ended up falling in love instead. I do, as with a lot of other people, wish that some of their kind of like married moments, because they get married in the book a lot earlier than they do in the show, and I wish that some of those married moments had made it into the show. Like, had they gotten married like an episode previous, I guess they got married in like the very last episode, didn't they? Yeah, had they like gotten married a little bit before, but that also, I mean, they changed the entire timeline of their relationship in the show, so to each their own, I guess. The next book I read was The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. This one I thoroughly enjoyed. I give it 4.5 stars. I think at times, sometimes the essays felt a little crammed for time, if that makes sense, in that like he would bring up some kind of personal aspect of the essay that obviously had a kind of lot of meaning, and that was in part why this thing that he was reviewing was so important to him, but he wouldn't give it enough like screen time to like really dive into it. And so I think the most effective essays were ones where he kind of did away with the premise of like reviewing this thing and went straight into the memory or the kind of experience that he wanted to talk about. But overall, I still really enjoyed them. He's hilarious. I loved listening to him read the book. I think he has a great reading voice. And yeah, would highly recommend it. It's as good as everyone says it is. And then 2 more that I'm going to quickly wrap up because I do actually have to go to class soon. The first of those was The Women of Brewster Place by Gloria Naylor. This one I gave 3.5 stars to. It's another kind of novel in stories about 7 women who are living in this place called Brewster Place in the 80s, which is when this book was published, and they all live really depressing lives, and it was just kind of depressing. I enjoyed Gloria Naylor's writing. I also enjoyed reading, I guess it's like a modern classic if you are also like more contemporary but still in the past novel. I thought that was interesting to kind of read about people's experiences who are, you know, probably would be a bit different than they would be in the present day. It was mostly just depressing is the biggest thing that I remember about it. And then last but not least, I read the Copenhagen trilogy for my book club, which is by Tove Ditlevsen. And this one I gave 4 stars to, and it's 3 memoirs kind of bound together in one volume. I definitely enjoyed the first 2, childhood and youth, more than I did the third one, which is Dependency. Again, Dependency was just like a little too depressing for me and also felt really like episodic, and I think also could have been expanded upon, but the first 2 I think were really powerful and definitely had a lot of moments of like very matter-of-fact, like devastating realizations that you experience during childhood as you kind of grow up and realize that the other people around you are humans who make mistakes and who you never will really understand, and all of those kind of things that you have to kind of come to terms with as you grow up, and also realizing that you're growing up and that you won't have the experiences that you had when you were younger. So I really enjoyed those elements of the first 2, and then the third one, as I said, just too depressing. So those are the 22 books that I read in the first quarter of 2022. I definitely will hopefully be vlogging more in the second quarter of 2022, but also I'm going to be in rural North Carolina for the summer. I don't know what the Wi-Fi situation will be like. I'm sure I have Wi-Fi, but I just don't know what that kind of all will look like. So I don't know how much vlogging I will be doing and like video making, but hopefully a bit more than I have this first quarter. So if you've read any of these books, please do chat with me about them down in the comment section below. Additionally, if you're new to my channel, I would love to have you stick around and subscribe. Finally, I hope you're having a great rest of your day whenever you watch this, and I will talk to you next time.